before. It had been a very divisive campaign, and it was open to a lot of questioning, including from Canadians, Canadian politicians, and public servants, because no one really knew who their counterparts were going to be, or whether they had any real experience in dealing with Canada. And this, in fact, proved to be the case. So, too, 2020, perhaps even more uncertainty, even when we do know who the president. Obviously, we know who he is, but who he was. He was vice president for 8 years. He was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. And Mr. Biden did a lot of other things in his long and illustrious political career. But in a way, there's even more uncertainty, because the US has been through a very tough election process. That's the political. But there's a global pandemic, a once in a century global pandemic that's still going on, which has precipitated an economic collapse, which has caused governments to really take measures to boost the economy, not to mention trying to vaccinate and their people and to save lives. So, as Canadians, I think we are looking south with our usual curiosity that we have for all things American. And in fact, many others in the world always come to us and say, well, you understand the Americans best. I used to think that. I'm not so sure anymore. So we look at it with hope and with a certain amount of fear. And then this peculiar characteristic, for which there is only a German word, Schadenfreude, taking a little bit of pleasure out of the misfortune of others, is how that translates. And I think there we have to be very careful, because we might style ourselves as postmodern and having very clear-cut elections and everything else in our country, but there can be a certain amount of seepage in terms of what has been happening in the United States: crisis of democracy, loss of faith in leadership, these sorts of issues that could permeate very much into the Canadian polity and into Canadian society. And this, I think, is exacerbated, and maybe I'll end there, with political polarization, in that the middle ground seems to be more difficult to find, including in Canada, and that has been accelerated through social media, where to perhaps misquote an American senator, Senator Moynihan, a few years ago, said that everyone is entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to pick their own facts. And I think that is the nub of part of the discussion that we'll probably have today. So, for Canada, I think it's a great opportunity for us to take the game to the Americans on a number of different issues that are important bilaterally and globally. But rest assured, everyone else on the planet's going to be trying to do the very same thing.
Well, let's get to some of those, kind of more traditional Canada-U.S. relations issues in just a minute. And before we get started, I just want to also encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A, because there will be time to ask some questions and address those. But let's turn back to what you mentioned earlier, Senator, about complacency, perhaps. It's been a very tumultuous political situation in the U.S. Divisive election, rancorous transition, culminating with a violent riot on Capitol Hill a few weeks ago. Should we be concerned? What do you think the impact is on Canadians? The Canadian psyche, Canadian culture.
Okay, thank you, Farah, for that. I think we have a fundamentally different electoral system in Canada. Now, whether it's better or not at this moment, it probably looks better. I recall also being in Washington for the Gore-Bush election and the hanging Chad crisis, which eventually took the election to the Supreme Court. Yet there was a peaceful transfer of power. In Canada, we don't have vote tabulating machines. It's pretty basic. You take a pencil, you make an X, and this has worked for us for ever since we've been a country, it seems. So there's that. But of course, in the campaigns and in campaign finance, there are there are similarities to some degree. We don't have super PACs in Canada, and in fact, I remember years ago Jean Chrétien saying that the entire Canadian election cost the same amount of money that Hillary Clinton paid to become senator from New York. So that gives a sense of perspective of how we do things. But in many ways, the issues are the same. They will be accentuated, exacerbated by this pandemic. People who have lost their jobs because of the pandemic in certain economic sectors will feel this more than others. They will feel that they are missing out. They are losing. In fact, they will be and are frustrated, and I see that in the mail that I get.
Mm-hmm.
And these are issues that are serious. Reform of healthcare, old age homes, all of these issues that are prevalent in the U.S., where there is a higher death rate than there is in Canada, are issues here in all of our countries, as well as the federal provincial interaction, the need to work together, and where there are jurisdictional differences constitutionally also exist in the U.S. But we have to look at ways where we can work together. And then maybe I'll stop on this point. There is the border between our countries, which we've always said is the longest undefended border in the world. It's not quite that anymore, and of course it has been severely restricted and closed for some time. Yet is an essential part of our existence as the northern neighbor of the U.S.
I guess just continuing on that, are you or should we be concerned about, rising populism in Canada? And if so, what do you think are some of the ways that we can combat that?
Well, populism, of course, can be broadly defined, and we're seeing it in different countries of the world. If we look back at the last Canadian election, there was a styled populist party, the People's Party of Canada, did not win any seats, a low percentage.
Mhm.
And the question is where this party, if it continues, will pick up support, or whether, in fact, one of the more mainstream parties will pick up support from those who are disenchanted with the system as it were. I like to think that in Canada we have established ourselves very well as a welcoming nation for people all over the world. We get a lot of newcomers, and maybe we'll talk about this later. But so is the U.S. But our society is not as stratified, in that the gap between the very rich and the middle class and those who are not who are poorer is not as vast or as great as in the U.S. That doesn't mean it can't happen here, but I think those are some of the fundamental differences, and I think we've done better on diversity as well, in terms of seeing that the ethos of diversity permeate our society from coast to coast to coast.
That's a great point you make about kind of like the underlying causes of populism. I think I heard Fareed Zakaria on The Current a few weeks ago talking about his book, and he put out this very interesting stat, just commenting on how, the profile of Trump's supporters, who were, 70 odd million people voted for him, represent a roughly 30% of the GDP of the US economy, while the, 78 close to 80 million people who voted for Joe Biden, their profile represents 70% of the GDP of the US. So you really see that inequality and stratification that you're talking about, and some of the causes there. I want to turn to something you already touched on, which is the pandemic and the economic crisis. Canada's economy is very dependent on the US economy. Very connected with the US economy. Joe Biden's already released a little bit of, I think, phase one of his plan for economic recovery. I'm curious what your thoughts are. What are the implications for the Canadian economic recovery of the plans he's taking? What are some of the challenges? What are, some of the upsides?
I think, well, many years ago, the economist Milton Friedman came out and said, we're all Keynesians now. And it's no truer moment than right now on the need for governments to engage in economic stimulus, both fiscally and then through their central banks on monetary policy. And in fact, that is what we're seeing, because subnational governments cannot do that. The federal governments can. The private sector can work with governments, but they can't do it either. So that in fact is exactly what's happening. I think in Joe Biden and his announced stimulus package, we'll see certain similarities to what we've been seeing in Canada in terms of supports provided for citizens, support for business, whether it's rent or seed money to keep going. And I'm thinking in particular of the services sector and the small and medium-sized enterprises that are impacted there. But I think we're also going to see two Joe Bidens. We're going to see the Joe Biden who will say, okay, internationally we've got to work together. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about that, but certainly in economic terms. And then he's going to say as well, but I am supporting the American worker and the American economy, and I'm doing this through Buy American, which will pose a challenge to a close trading partner like Canada. It will pose a challenge to supply chains, and in fact, as I've written recently, even under the new NAFTA, there will be challenges both on softwood lumber and on the dairy sector and our supply and management system. And in fact, those two issues are already going to arbitration. So there's some things in our relationship with the U.S. that work wonderfully, maybe about 90% of the time, but 10% of the time we have these hardy perennials, and those are two examples.
That's a really important point, because I think a lot of people, maybe don't realize that Biden also has there's a lot of support domestically for obviously supporting American jobs. Maybe not bringing back manufacturing jobs the way Trump had wanted to, but definitely as part of this recovery plan, bringing back job creation. Yeah, maybe let's turn to foreign affairs. I know it's a issue certainly in your wheelhouse. It's definitely one area where, Biden is expected to take a very different approach than Trump had. And by different, we mean kind of a more of a return to the rules-based international order. Can you just shed some light on some of your thoughts on how you think Biden's going to approach foreign policy, how it's going to be different, and most importantly, the implications for Canada?
Well, I think, first of all, for those who are expecting all kinds of wholesale change led by the president, I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's going to delegate a lot, simply because he has this tremendous domestic crisis to manage. So it's not just the political divide that the election indicated, but the economic, and of course the pandemic, the safety of citizens. So I think he will give a lot to Tony Blinken as his putative Secretary of State, to his National Security Council team in terms of handling it. He's been clear in the campaign that the U.S. will want to get back into the World Health Organization. Quite frankly, pulling out of that mid-pandemic, regardless of flaws that are in the WHO, was a rather silly move on the part of the Trump administration. So he wants to do that. He wants to get back into the Paris Agreement. So on climate change. So this will also jive with the domestic plan that Mr. Biden has. And then we'll look at ways and means to engage allies on some of the very important issues, whether they are connected to the rules-based international order. And I have vivid memories of the big fight we had with Mr. Trump and others on his team at Charlevoix at the summit on that very point. Or getting together like-minded governments to think about how China should be engaged, as we are seeing a more assertive China on the globe. And of course, as Canada, we have firsthand experience of that. So I think it'll be a sort of a chair of the board approach. The good thing is that he knows several world leaders. including our prime minister, and that was not the case back in 2017 when Mr. Trump was inaugurated.
China is, of course, a very interesting issue, very contentious one. Canada is not the only kind of smaller country that's been dealing with the wrath, I guess you would say, of China on some issues. Australia, Norway as well. I guess, what are your thoughts on Biden's approach to China, how it's going to be different, And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how China feels about, Biden. The being a bit tough on China does have bipartisan support in Congress. So he will be expected to kind of stand tall, maybe in a coalition. I'm wondering if you're hearing anything about how China feels.
Well, I speak to Chinese diplomats frequently. And I think there's a sense there that maybe there'll be a more predictable approach, less weaponization of tariffs. Of course, we felt that as well. It wasn't just China, and President Biden knows President Xi, so there are those bridges that have already been built. However, on the other hand, engagement is important, but not engagement without consequence. So there are still very large economic issues. China is just too large a global player and an economy to ignore, or to have one country stand up and say, oh, well, we're not going to play with you, and we're just going to ignore you and do what you like, or we will impose sanctions on you. It's not really that simple. So by working in concert with others on questions of investment, of the economy, of steel oversupply, which has been an issue in the past, that then can provide some of the backdrop to have serious conversations about the pressure on democracy in Hong Kong and on democratic actors, on the human rights situation more generally, on the fate of the Uyghurs in the western part of China, and indeed on Chinese geostrategic interests in the South China Sea, and that would include Taiwan in that discussion. So it's a very big palette or menu, depending on how you look at it, but no country can do this alone. And there are some who've had varying and different experiences. Australia comes to mind. The Nordic countries have also received punitive measures from China for awarding a Nobel Peace Prize, for example. And we have our own experience here in Canada with the two Michaels, with canola and the like. So there's a lot to discuss there. And Mr. Biden's plan to convene leaders of democracy, to adopt democracies in the world, to have a good discussion on that seems to be a good one.
One more question, just a follow-up question on China. I guess, in your opinion, are you optimistic that this coalition, approach, will lead to progress?
Well, it depends on how you define progress. The Communist Party of China is celebrating its centenary this year. There will be parts of its centenary they probably won't want to celebrate as much, but it is an institution, and China is a global actor. My view on this, from my own experience, is that you have to have engagement, and even at the darkest moments of the Cold War with the former Soviet Union, the West did have engagement with Moscow, and we're not at that stage by any means, and hopefully we won't be with Beijing. But there has to be engagement. There has to be discussion, and it has to be frank. And on the part of the democracies, it has to be a concerted approach. It was not a concerted approach over the past few years, certainly not led by the United States.
Yeah, definitely not. I want to be mindful of time, but I also want to get to another very topical issue that's been in the news recently, and that's energy and climate change policy. There's news, I don't know if it was just yesterday, that Biden is not gonna is going to put a stop to the Keystone XL pipeline. But we also know that he has made a very strong commitment to climate change, as you mentioned, rejoining the Paris Agreement and transforming the U.S. economy to be cleaner, greener. So there's some, pluses and minuses there for Canada. Kind of where does that leave, the Canadian government and the Canadian energy sector?
In a very difficult position, I would say. It's complicated. I think well, everyone knew what Mr. Biden thought of Keystone XL, and during the Obama administration, it was turned down. Various Canadian governments, I think back to Mr. Harper and Mr. Trudeau, have engaged on this file. The government of Alberta, of course, has bought a stake as well. It's about jobs in Canada. In the West, it's about energy extraction. It's also about jobs in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So having that discussion is important. We have another pipeline. It's moving along, the Trans Mountain, that the federal government has purchased. That will assuage some of it, but I do think that there will need to be discussions. These discussions will take place. There might be some legal approaches after a decision is formally taken. I don't know. But there's also something else in the U.S. relationship that I find interesting. It is not on energy extraction, but it is using the notion of green and efficient energy to look towards the future. And these are the two big contracts that have been put forward by General Motors
Mm-hmm.
and Ford for building electric powered vehicles in Ontario. More jobs for Ontario, good for Ontario, not so good for Alberta on the energy extraction side. So maybe there is a way where our governments can meet up and say, okay, federal government of Canada has a green plan. Biden has a green plan. There might be a North American approach that could be followed. Let's not forget that Obama and the former Mexican president and Mr. Trudeau met in Ottawa and basically inked a deal for North American climate change and environmental type work. Whether this can be done with AMLO in Mexico City or not, I don't know. The new NAFTA provides some scope for that as well, but this might be an opportunity to take the game to the Americans. And I know we have IPAC participants who are also with provincial governments or municipal governments. This can happen at the subnational level as well as it has in the past between Ontario, Quebec, and California, for example, on
Mm-hmm.
cap and trade issues, and also cities can twin and see what they can do. So there is potential there. The issue is whether there is political will and mutual interest.
Yeah, and I guess you don't sound very optimistic that, Biden will reverse this policy on Keystone XL. I mean, he's got a very different Democratic Party than Obama did, with some very kind of progressives that he's gotten support from. Is that your assessment?
Well, I'm not overly optimistic, but I do think there has to be discussion. And of course, when I saw that John Kerry was being named as the climate change czar with cabinet level, it was John Kerry as Secretary of State who recommended the turn down of Keystone XL previously. So we can't delude ourselves in thinking that the Americans will say, "Oh, well, there's Canada, our good friend, and we won't make good on that campaign promise," when in fact there are many actors within the Democratic Party in the United States who are determined to see that pipeline does not go forward. So it is a difficult fix. It will require, I think, discussion between the Prime Minister and Premier Kenney, and a plan in terms of how to try to deal with this. Maybe they can get creative and say, okay, we're all sort of committed to phasing out fossil fuels by 2050. Why don't we go ahead with this and put a 30-year moratorium on it, or something like that. I don't know. I'm not an energy expert, but there has to be discussion.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult political and public policy kind of challenge ahead. If anyone has any, I'm just going to prompt people again to enter their questions if they have any. I do want to turn now. We talked a little bit. You touched on trade. Obviously, the Canada-U.S. trade relationship very important. It was very tense under Donald Trump's administration. You know, renegotiating NAFTA, tariffs on steel, aluminum, etc. But you cautioned that there still may be some, you know, landmines ahead of us. And I wanted you to just get into a little bit about what you think the Canada-U.S. trade relationship will be like going forward.
Well, I mentioned the hardy perennials earlier, and I remember when the planes hit on 9/11, I was in the boardroom in our embassy in Washington with our ambassador, and we were having a big discussion on what else, softwood lumber. So every time we as Canada seem to get 30% of US or a third of US market share, so it's like we trip a wire down there, and the US industry, which is very different than ours because it's all based on private woodlots, they get excited, they pressure politically, and then we have an eruption, as it were. So too with dairy and supply management. I had the good fortune of being with Prime Minister Trudeau a number of times when President Trump raised the dairy farmers of Wisconsin with him and how unfair our practices were. And so too, there was a little bit of give in the last NAFTA negotiations on filtered milk and the like. That's not going to save the dairy industry in Wisconsin because they are oversupplying. But those are going to be the sorts of issues that we look at, and also in terms of remedies and dispute settlement, it's not clear. Going back to the last point we were discussing, whether Keystone XL will fit into this in terms of the new NAFTA or not. So I think we've got to be quite careful and vigilant, as we always are, through our embassy, through our 12 consulates general, and through the relationships that our cabinet ministers make with US cabinet secretaries as well. Globally, Canada has been chairing a process known as a group known as the Ottawa Group that is looking at reform of the World Trade Organization. And Obama, before Trump, also thought that the WTO needed some improvement, particularly on dispute settlement issues and modernization. It would be very wise, I think, for Canada to go to the U.S. saying, "Hey, we've been chairing this group, and it's a concern for us that the WTO get moving along. You've indicated, Mr. Biden, that you want to do this. Here are some areas that we could explore." So if Canada were to take a lead and discuss this with President Biden and with the new USTR once she is confirmed, that would be, I think, a good thing and would show some leadership. So the trade picture, I think, is complex. It is bilateral, and it is also, of course, a multilateral discussion that has to take place.
We have a question from the audience kind of related on that multilateral topic. Just talking about the US and how Biden goes about repairing his relationship with traditional allies, particularly the G7. Trump had isolated the US quite a bit on that stage.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about your thoughts about how Biden should proceed in that regard.
Well, Mr. Trump was saved from the pandemic, or maybe the rest of the G7 were, and not ever having a summit. It was the U.S. year last year, 2020. The U.S. chaired the G7. The U.S. did a lot in terms of pandemic coordination and also on the injection of liquidity. The first I think $3 trillion tranche through the IMF into the global economy. So there was some work that the U.S. had done, but a traditional summit did not take place because of the pandemic and because it looked like it would be just before the election, and I don't think any of the leaders wanted to have photo ops at that time. So it falls to the Brits, and Prime Minister Johnson will be in the chair. The British, as I understand, have already started, and they have an added incentive in that they've cut loose from Europe now. So this idea of global Britain is out there. They're going to want to show some leadership. All eyes will be on Mr. Biden going to this event. And the UK will also be hosting the next COP meeting on climate change this year as well. So there's an opportunity there to get things back on track, assuming one can, to look at the big issues and the emergency issues. And first and foremost, it's the pandemic, it's COVID, and the global economy. So there's an opportunity there for Biden and his team. I'm sure they will seize it. And there's an opportunity there for Canada as well, because I'm biased, but I thought we had a pretty good presidency in 2018. And we launched a number of initiatives that are still alive. In fact, there are some that are still alive from Mr. Harper's tenure as Prime Minister as well. So there's lots that can be done. The question is finding the time and seeing whether traditional in-person meetings where you can achieve so much is really a viable thing as we move into the spring and the summer.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, Senator, I mean, Biden's primary focus will be on domestic issues and the domestic economy, and you know, delegating some of those international affairs issues to still build the kind of relationships that he needs to. There's another question from the audience, an interesting one about your thoughts on whether there's any areas in which you see the Biden administration putting pressure on Canada to kind of adjust policy, and they give the example about asking us to increase our expenditures on national defense areas like that.
All right, that's going to continue. That first commitment on a 2% increase was made at a NATO summit in 2012 in Wales. So it's not new. It is there. I think the onus is probably more on the Europeans. Simply because the European picture has changed as well. So there will be a discussion on that in the NATO context. I think our discussion in North America might very well be on NORAD. And is NORAD still viable? Obviously, the focus is still the threat posed by a major nuclear power across the pole, the Russian Federation, but there's also North Korea. That's part of this question now as well. The new administration might want to look at some of our border issues that have been around for some time. We've been renegotiating the Columbia River Treaty, and there's the International Joint Commission, which looks after the water boundaries between Canada and the US and the shared water resources, particularly the Great Lakes. So some of the environmental push that the Biden administration is putting forward could manifest itself there, and indeed with the border states as well. And there, I think we have pretty good relationships, including at the subnational level, where the various governors association, whether it's the Pacific Northwest or the Atlantic or the Central, they meet with our premiers. I suspect this will, once the COVID restriction is off, this will continue again. And I also think there will be some more parliamentary discussion. We have a very robust Canada-US parliamentary intergovernmental group comprised of senators and members of parliament on our end, and the same thing on the U.S. and members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So there will be ways to explore some of these issues. But in terms of a direct pressure point coming early on, I don't see one on the horizon. There will be the trade issues, but we'll see.
We're almost at time, but I did want to ask, there is one more question from the audience, and I wanted to give an opportunity for that. And it's about, you know, whether you can, you know, your thoughts on international relations in the pandemic context. So, you know, you kind of mentioned it already about virtual fora and whether as much can be accomplished in those virtual forums as could be, you know, in international in-person meetings, which many of you have participated in. Are certain things, have you noticed, felt certain things are happening faster in the pandemic that are simply harder? And likewise, given this is going to be a virtual transition.
Yeah, well, I just also saw something flash up on the screen. One of the big things that Mr. Biden said is the U.S. wants to get back into the WHO, and we should encourage that because we've emerged as a big contributor to COVAX, and that's the international vaccine initiative. Because there are countries, there are people who are going to be left behind, and they will be vulnerable. They will lose health, lives, or in some cases, children will lose education for 1, if not for 2 years or more. So I think that's an area where we can work together. I don't know if anyone participating in this remembers the last time they shook someone's hand in greeting, or in fact, if you're in the diplomatic mode. I wrote a piece recently about the part of the title was "The End of the Air Kiss." None of this is happening anymore. So the traditional forms of interaction, where internationally, if you have a point of disagreement and you go off into a room and you take a couple chairs, have a coffee or a drink, and you discuss it and hammer out a compromise. This is a lot more difficult to do on Zoom, on WebEx or Teams or whatever you're using, and we're finding that too as parliamentarians in Canada, including in our committee work. So it's the same globally. So humans, we're very adaptable, and we've adapted to new realities, but it's tough, and foreign policy is hard. It's not easy. You have to be patient. You can't be absolutist. You can't be threatening, and that's what makes this next period, I think, very difficult. And we will probably have to reevaluate how we conduct our foreign policy as Canada, and perhaps there's no better country to begin with than the U.S., where a lot of our foreign issues are in fact, and a former boss and mentor of mine, George Haenel, came up with the term, are in fact intermestic. They're international and they are domestic, and they are intermestic. So there's an opportunity for Canada there if we choose to seize the moment.
Well, those are very wise words, I think, to end on. And I just wanted to say, I mean, I think we could keep going forever.
Yeah,
I just wanted
your
to say thank
fire
you,
is burning very well there, so it's
very
great.
bright.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you. You know, all your experience, your insight on behalf of the audience. I know we found it valuable and very engaging. So merci. And I think I need to turn it over now to Tara, who's going to transition us into the workshop